Good morning everybody, and welcome to this video in my series on Wide Sargasso Sea, a fabulous novel by the writer Jean Rhys. And today we're still looking at part one of the novel, and we're going to talk about Antoinette's time in the convent towards the end of part one. Make sure you're taking notes as you're watching this. As usual, you can pause the video, copy down the note-taking sheet and then continue when you're ready. Right, at the end of part one then, there are a number of really key events which are pivotal to understanding the rest of the novel. So first of all, we have the fire at Calibri, and one of the questions you might want to ask yourself about this fire is who is to blame for it. And I suppose the answer personally that I would come to is that Mr. Mason is largely to blame. He has arrived on the island, married Antoinette's mother, and with that huge sense of entitlement and colonial arrogance has ignored all of the people around him, has ignored the warnings that the family have given him that he's antagonising the locals, and therefore I would suggest that he is to blame for that fire. But that fire causes the death of Pierre, Antoinette's younger brother, and means that the family lose not only their home, but also we see the symbolic destruction of the colonial project as well in the burning down of the house. Another key event at this stage of the novel is Antoinette's descent into madness and her eventual death. Now, after the fire, Antoinette is ill for about 6 weeks and she doesn't see her mother. Then when she does go to see her mother seems to be completely mad. She's locked away in a house, being looked after by a couple of servants, but separate from her husband. And we never actually discover the reason why Annette dies. Then we learn about Antoinette's education. So she's initially a day student at a convent, and she's living with her Aunt Cora. And then when her Aunt Cora goes to England, she seems to be a boarding student at the convent. Mr. Mason then decides that Antoinette is going to marry, and that's where we end part one of the novel. Oh yes, sorry, we have Antoinette's nightmare as well, which is prompted by this reference to her marriage. And these events are told non-chronologically, so that means that they're not really told in the order that they take place. So instead, the narrative circles around the events. It interweaves them, it layers them, it moves backwards and forwards between them in order to make connections between them. So, for example, Antoinette's nightmare is very closely linked to this realisation that she's going to marry an English stranger. And then, even though actually we learn that her mother's died some time before, after the realisation that Antoinette's going to marry, after the nightmare, we then learn that the mother's marriage to an English stranger has resulted in her death. So what Jean Rhys is trying to do is make these connections between these ideas and parallel Antoinette's experience with Annette's experience as well. If Annette's marriage to an Englishman has resulted in her madness and death, that then foreshadows what's going to happen to Antoinette when she is unwillingly married off to another Englishman. Annettes Madness is a central part of the novel, and I suppose one of the questions about her madness is, why does it happen? So from our perspective, reading the novel in 2020, we can understand that Annette has been through a harrowing event. She's warned her husband that the family is in danger, her fears have been ignored, she's been belittled, her husband has treated her very unkindly. When she's become angry with him, probably justifiably angry from our perspective, he says that she's acting like a wildcat. So he's assuming that she's descending into some kind of hysterical female madness, when actually possibly what she's doing is she's just desperate to keep her family safe. Then, after that, Annette's son perishes in the fire, she loses her house, her daughter is seriously ill, and then Annette herself is locked away from her family, away from her husband. So from our perspective, what we can see is that the madness isn't inherited, it's a consequence of this horrific trauma, a series of traumas that Annette has been through. However, from the perspective of a lot of characters in the novel, this madness is in some way an inherent part of being part of the Causeway family. It's inherited, it's passed down through the generations. And so people in the novel now start to talk about Antoinette as having inherited this madness from her mother. So towards the start of this particular section of part one, Antoinette says that somehow at some point, she's not quite sure when, she'd been awake before and heard my mother screaming Kia la, and then don't touch me. And this Kia la, we remember, is the phrase that Coco the parrot says and repeats, and that's mentioned during the fire sequence, and it means who is there. And it shows us a really clear parallel between Annette and the parrot almost comes to symbolise Annette's experience. And we've learnt during that fire sequence, and I mentioned it during the last video, that the parrot's wings have been clipped by Mr. Mason, and that is the reason why the parrot can't fly away from the fire, and that's the reason why he dies. And so here we see that symbolically Annette's wings have been clipped by Mr. Mason. She's been locked up, she's been trapped, she's been restricted by him, and in a sense I suppose we could argue that that's why she dies in the end, that it's that restriction that sends her mad. And then Antoinette also hears her mother saying, "I'll kill you if you touch me. Coward, hypocrite, I'll kill you." Now, presumably here, this is Antoinette overhearing Annette talking to Mr. Mason, and she is saying coward because he refused to defend his family. Hypocrite because she had told him what was going to happen. She had warned him, and he didn't pay any attention to it. And presumably now he's saying that it's Annette's fault that the house was burned down in the fire. And so this is taken by the characters as a sign of Annettes' madness. But actually, as I've said, from our perspective, this is kind of justifiable. Annette is very angry at Mr. Mason because her son has died in the fire that he could potentially have prevented. And so Antoinette then puts her hands over her ears. Her screams were so loud and terrible. And this trauma that Antoinette is then going through, hearing her mother in this situation, contributes towards her own madness later on in the novel. But as I've said, from our perspective, this madness isn't inherited. It's a result of what the patriarchal, the colonial system, the class system does to the women who are caught up in it. Later on then in part 1, Antoinette visits her mother, who's fixated on the fact that he, Pierre, is dead. And Antoinette shakes her head and says, "But I am here, I said." And she said no, quietly. So we have rejection here from Antoinette's mother. And then no, very loudly, and flung me from her. I fell against the partition and hurt myself. So obviously this is a very deeply upsetting rejection for Antoinette. But it's really interesting what happens later on, because this scene has been witnessed by the servants who are looking after Antoinette's mother. And then later on, when Antoinette is going to school in the convent, a girl who she doesn't know says to her in the street, "You're crazy like your mother. Your mother walk about with no shoes and stockings on her feet. She's sans culotte. She tries to kill her husband, and she tried to kill you too that day you go to see her. She have eyes like a zombie, and you have eyes like a zombie too." So this very kind of personal rejection of Antoinette by her mother has then been repeated, and I suppose in a series of kind of Chinese whispers has been exaggerated to this accusation that Annette has tried to kill her own daughter. And this is clearly being talked about by the whole community, and that's adding to Antoinette's isolation, that even the people who are looking after her mother are gossiping about what's going on. And then we've also got this assumption, "You crazy like your mother," so that this madness is going to be passed down to Antoinette. And then we've got a mention of a zombie here as well. Now, we've got a particular preconception of a zombie from different horror films, but there's a very specific meaning of zombie in Wide Sargasso Sea and in the Caribbean at this time. And really, this refers to someone's spirit being stolen. And for Antoinette, from her perspective, that's what's happened to Annette. Mr. Mason has stolen Annette's spirit and taken that away from her. But the assumption that's happening here in society is that this is also happening to Antoinette too. Then Antoinette, after that, at the very end of part 1, narrates her mother's death, and she says, "No one told me how, and I didn't ask." So there's a whole mystery here about how Annette dies, whose fault it is, what's happened, and this is a mystery that Antoinette carries throughout her own life and on into her marriage with Rothschild. After that, chronologically after that, although before that, in the way it's narrated in the novel, Antoinette goes to the convent and starts going to school there. And initially, the convent provides Antoinette with refuge from the world and offers her an approximation of the feeling of safety she originally had in the Garden of Calibri. So after all of the traumas that we've seen, we have a little bit of a break, a lighter tone here as her life at the convent is described. However, the description of the convent and the students' activities shouldn't be overlooked because it also portrays the stereotypical expectations of women during the Victorian era. And if you want to do a feminist reading of this text, this is a really interesting section of it to look at. So one aspect of this is that the girls are taught needlework, and Antoinette has a very small rebellion against this because she imagines that her needle squeaking sounds like swearing. Now it's interesting that Antoinette's rebellion is all to do with language and the use of words, and I've talked before in these videos about how language itself is power, and language can be a form of rebellion and also repression. And the girls at the convent also have to wash themselves under their chemise in order to remain modest, and there's a really interesting kind of description of them learning the skill to do this, to retain their kind of feminine purity. But this is balanced by Antoinette's fascination with the physical appearance of the women she comes into contact with. So she talks about other women's dresses, how their waists look, how they do their hair. She tries to learn to do her hair in a particular way, because Antoinette realises in this patriarchal and capitalist society, beauty is everything. Beauty is, in a sense, a commodity which can be sold, which can be bartered for financial security. And throughout this time we've got an interweaving of references to the treatment of Annette, locked up, very ill, with Annette's time at the convent, and this can be interpreted in terms of the Madonna-whore dichotomy. So this idea that women on the one hand should be like Madonna, should be perfect, should be pure, should be virginal, should be chaste, and behaving in this very stereotypical way. On the other hand, if a woman isn't like that, if a woman has any kind of rebellion against that, or tries to have her own voice, or stand up for herself, then she's, I suppose, almost labelled as a whore, as someone who's mad, as someone who needs to be kept away from society. And this then feeds into the accusations later in the novel that both Annette and Antoinette have been sexually unfaithful to their partners, and that there's something kind of a lack of fidelity with them to the men in their lives. What we see as well towards the end of part 1 is the gradual expectation of Antoinette's marriage, and the seeds of this are sown very early on in part 1. After being injured in the fire, when Antoinette is still a child, she asks, "Will I have a mark on my forehead?" And Aunt Cora responds, "It won't spoil you on your wedding day." Now, it's a very unusual response, and I suppose it'd be quite easy to pass over that in the novel. But what we're seeing here again is this sense of beauty as a commodity which needs to be protected, to be safeguarded, to be perfected, in order for a woman to achieve a good marriage and a good sense of financial stability, not just for herself, but also for the reputation of her family. And the way Aunt Cora says this as well, "It won't spoil you," the wording of that sounds very much like Antoinette as almost an object, you know, a bit of food that could go off, or a dress that could be torn or spoiled, like her muslin dress was earlier on in part 1, which just shows us the very insidious workings of the patriarchy, the fact that women are being treated in this way. Then, when Antoinette is about 17, Mr. Mason starts visiting the convent a little bit more regularly. So he hasn't really been to see her much before this, but he starts to come quite frequently now, and he brings her sweets, a locket, a bracelet, once a very pretty dress. And the dress is completely useless because Antoinette can't wear it in the convent, where they have a very strict dress code. And presumably Mr. Mason would know this. And these gifts are actually indications that he's preparing Antoinette for the marriage market, and he's dressing her up beautifully so that she's ready for that. Then this develops a little bit further. At the end of part 1, there's a final visit from Mr. Mason, and he says you can't be hidden away all your life. Now, there's a very deep level of irony here, because actually that is exactly what's going to happen to Antoinette after she marries Rochester. She is going to be locked away for the rest of her life. But here what Mr. Mason means is that she's got to go out into society, and he needs to marry her off for a financial benefit. And then he says, I have asked some English friends to spend next winter here. You won't be dull. So on the surface, what he means is he's preparing a society for her, he's preparing friends for her to talk to give her a bit of entertainment so that she won't be bored when she leaves the convent. But actually, what Antoinette understands by this, and what Mr. Mason means by this, is he's invited friends, one friend in particular, that she is going to marry. And at this point, Antoinette remembers something that we've read on the very first page of the novel. That morning when I found the dead horse, say nothing and it may not be true. And that dead horse becomes a symbol of the violence that can be done to individuals, of the I suppose debasement that Antoinette feels when she learns that she's just going to be married off, a little bit like a horse in market. And again, this foreshadows what's going to happen to her later on in the novel. And then this reference to language again, remember that comment about language and power, say nothing and it may not be true. So here we've got this idea that she's trying to use, instead of her language, her silence, in order to try and gain some kind of power over the situation. After that we have Antoinette's nightmare, and we'll just read through this before we talk about it. So in her nightmare she says, again I have left the house at Calibri. It is still night and I am walking towards the forest. I am wearing a long dress and thin slippers, so I walk with difficulty, following the man who is with me and holding up the skirt of my dress. It is white and beautiful and I don't wish to get it soiled. I follow him, sick with fear, but I make no effort to save myself. If anyone were trying to save me, I would refuse. This must happen. So in this first section here, we see her leaving the house at Calibri, which for her symbolised safety, a retreat from the world, a kind of stability in this almost perfect Edenic situation. So she leaves that and she walks towards the forest. And in a fairy tale, a forest would symbolise fear, trepidation, adventure, but also a great level of danger as well. And we've got this repetition of the dress. Remember, Mr. Mason had given her a dress to wear at the convent. Tia had swapped dresses with her as well, and then she'd had to look for a new dress to wear when meeting Mr. Mason for the first time. So all of these references to the dress are really important, because she's trying to keep her dress white and beautiful, and that white symbolises this idea of the Madonna, the purity that she wishes to retain, and then she doesn't wish to get that dress, that purity, soiled. So there's a kind of sexual implication to this dream as well, that she's being led by this man into a situation that she's quite afraid of. Remember as well that she's already seen a snake in the garden at Calibri, and that snake kind of symbolising her fear of sexuality as well. So she follows this man, and the tone of the dream starts to change, and she says, I do not try to hold up my dress. It trails in the dirt, my beautiful dress. So this feeling that as she gets deeper into this relationship with her man, her purity is being destroyed, and that's represented in what's happening to the dress. And then they're in an enclosed garden. Now this description of the enclosed garden surrounded by a stone wall, the trees are different trees. This sounds very much like Antoinette is almost imagining the garden at Thornfield Hall in England, which is where Rochester takes her and locks her up. And this sense of enclosure, of everything kind of trapping her just the way her mother has been trapped, is quite dominant here as well. We've got the stone wall and we've got the So this dream, I guess, is an accumulation of the different fears that Antoinette has after watching the situation that her mother has been in, but it also foreshadows what's going to happen to her in her relationship with Rochester, that fact that her purity is going to be soiled, and she's going to be taken and enclosed in a garden with different trees. She's going to be enclosed in an English setting. And then at the end of this, she tells the person at the convent, "I dreamed I was in hell." So this sense of difference, going to a different place, an unknown place, being taken away from the landscape that she feels comfortable in, for Antoinette is the equivalent of hell. For your independent learning task then for this, I want you to think back throughout the whole of part 1 and bring together your understanding of the symbolic language in this section. So the pennies, the dress, nature, Coco and the parrot, the mirrors and the fire as well. And come up with some quotations, so 1 or 2 quotes for each symbol, and then I want you to do some analysis of those. So what do these symbolically represent? How does it link to Reese's wider intentions, to the ideas that Reese is trying to communicate? And also start to link it to theory, so post-colonialism, feminism, Marxism. How can this connect to the different theories that we've looked at as well? Okay, thank you very much for listening, and in the next video in this series we're going to start to look at part 2 of the novel.